Welcome back. Well, today I am joined by Dr. Amber Burnette, who is here on behalf of Kaiser Permanente, Orange County. Well, Dr. Burnette, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm happy to be here and talk to everyone today.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time because there has just been so much controversy and so much crazy information. We can't decide, what's right, what's wrong. It's just been kind of a whirlwind with everything regarding vaccinations.
Yeah.
So now our community, we have 55 and over folks, and the majority of them are vaccinated, and which is great news. But of course, there's lots of questions that are coming up regarding the potential booster shots, and we know that that's still not been full force going through. But maybe you can help us shed some light on it. Now, Pfizer being the first one potentially for a booster, what do you know about all that?
Sure. I'm really glad we're having this conversation right now because it's very timely. I know that, yesterday, which is Monday the 20th, a lot of patients showed up at our vaccine centers expecting to get their boosters because they heard a little bit about the FDA discussion on Friday. And it's very, it's not surprising that people were confused because there is so much information going on. There's so many, we're learning more. The vaccine manufacturers are constantly submitting new data on how effective their vaccines are, whether boosters are needed, whether boosters are not needed. And so it can be difficult to keep up with all this information. And I will say that as our vaccine physician lead for Kaiser Permanente Orange County, I am constantly scouring the news, the medical journals, and everything, trying to understand what's going on. So just a little bit about the discussion of boosters and how this arose and why Pfizer is the first to be considered, because I know people who may have received Moderna or Johnson & Johnson are asking, what about me? What's going on? So first of all, we want to keep in mind, I'm so thrilled to hear that the majority of the community is vaccinated. That is absolutely the safest and best way to protect you against COVID. We know that people, especially those over age 65, are extremely high risk for really severe disease from COVID, for hospitalization, or even death. And so vaccination is absolutely the best way to protect yourself. And I'm so thrilled to hear that so many people have made that choice to protect themselves in that way. In the beginning of the vaccine campaign earlier this year, based on the initial data that was presented by the vaccine manufacturers, the vaccines were expected to be somewhere between 90 to 95% effective in protecting against infection, hospitalization, and death. And when the vaccines were being developed, we were hoping that it would be something as good as maybe a flu shot. Flu shots usually are somewhere between about 50 to 80% protected, depending on what strains of influenza are circulating each year. And so when we get our influenza vaccines, we know that usually we're somewhere around 60 or 70% protected, but it definitely saves lives. And it's something that we need to do. And you do that knowing you may still get infected, you may still become ill, but you shouldn't be hospitalized usually with influenza. So for there to be vaccines available that were expected to be 90 to 95% protective was just unheard of, amazing. And that's why the medical community was so excited for us to have vaccines that are that protective against this horrible virus. And initially, that was holding true. But what we've seen, and many studies have been presented over the last month and a half or so, including data from Israel and also the United States, is that over time, it seems like the protection, the immunity against COVID does wane, even in those who've been vaccinated. And I want to say this, and I will say this a few times. Even though the infection protection, the protection against infection does seem to be waning to some degree, protection against hospitalization and death is still holding up very, very well. And so that is the most important thing. We take these vaccines to keep us from dying from COVID or getting so sick that we get hospitalized. And the vaccines are still holding up very well for that. But what we're seeing is that people were becoming more at risk of moderate to severe illness, of getting sick, and maybe sicker than what we would have expected a few months ago. And the researchers and those who were reviewing all this scientific data, trying to understand what was going on, were unclear on whether or not this was just because it'd been a length of time since people completed their vaccination series. So just over time, is their immunity starting to decrease a little bit? Or is it the Delta variant? The Delta variant is horrifically contagious. We know that it's something around 20 times as contagious as the original strain of COVID. And so it wasn't clear if this was just that the vaccines aren't holding up as well against Delta, or if it's that over time, people's immune systems are starting to lose a little bit of this protection.
Mhm.
So as these studies have been presented and reviewed, including this whole, all this data was reviewed for Pfizer on Friday, there were a lot of discussions about, okay, what level of antibodies in your body means that you are immune? And that answer honestly is not completely clear, which is surprising. Even to me, I would like to know that. So that would give us a little bit more of a clear benchmark on when you need to be boosted. But because we don't have that data, they really just kind of looked at infection rates, in people and hospitalization rates. And we're seeing that over time, we are starting to see a little bit more hospitalizations and more breakthrough infections and things like that, even in the vaccinated population. So the determination was made to consider providing boosters for those who are 65 and up, and those who are quote unquote at risk for severe illness from COVID, which is a very kind of nebulous category because that can mean a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about this because you asked me about Pfizer. I know several people have said, well, why was Pfizer first? And I think it's important for us to remember that Pfizer has kind of been ahead of the game in terms of timeline from the get-go. They were the first to start the clinical trials last summer. So in summer of 2020, they were the first to start the clinical trials. Moderna started about a month or two later. Therefore, Pfizer had data from their clinical trials first, then Moderna, and then Johnson & Johnson. And so when it came to submit their data for consideration for the emergency use authorization for these vaccines, Pfizer submitted first, and then Moderna, and then Johnson & Johnson. So when they, kind of hit the market, when they became available, it came in that order. And basically it's been going that way throughout the vaccination campaign. So the reason that Pfizer was considered first is because they submitted their data to the FDA for consideration first. It doesn't mean that Pfizer is worse or better or anything else like that. It just means they got their information in first. So that's the kind of the first part of it.
Yeah, no, I mean that makes a lot of sense. But here's something I think people will be questioning is whether or not, okay, so I got Moderna, right, or I got Johnson & Johnson. Can I get the Pfizer booster? Because I know originally when they had the first vaccine, they had to have the second vaccine of the same brand.
Yeah.
Is that also going to hold true for boosters?
That is the $1 million question right now. And I will, I'm going to answer it for you and then tell you kind of the things that go through our own minds, especially as healthcare workers who are among the first to be vaccinated. Because again, we completed, most of us, our series in January. So we're now 8 months out. And the discussion on Friday was that maybe people who are around 6 to 8 months out need to be getting boosters. So there's certainly a lot of concern in the medical community about, do we need to be getting our boosters right now because we're seeing patients with COVID where, we have that potential exposure. So for the initial vaccination series, for the mRNA, messenger RNA vaccines, which are Moderna and Pfizer, it's a 2-dose series for what we call the primary series. So for you to complete your full vaccination was 2 doses. And then for Johnson & Johnson was 1. And you are supposed to match them because the vaccines, even though they're similar, the messenger RNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer are similar, they're not quite the same. The amount of messenger RNA contained within them is a little bit different. The timing between the first dose and the second dose is different. For Pfizer, it's 3 weeks. For Moderna, it's 4 weeks. And there's been kind of information coming out like maybe that second dose should be a little bit longer. Maybe that provides a better boost to the immune system. And there's questions about that. There's certainly questions about mixed dose series, meaning, people got Moderna and then they got Pfizer. I do know some people, because I run our vaccine center who have taken it upon themselves to get multiple series. So they got a full series of Moderna, full series of Pfizer because they just wanted extra protection. We certainly don't recommend that people do that, but people have been doing a lot of things over the course of this year. And there are some studies that are looking at mixed dose series to see if you can get one and then the other, and does that work? We know that, and forgive me because I can't remember if it's the United Kingdom or Canada, did a study looking at the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not approved for use in the United States. Right. But they looked at the AstraZeneca vaccine and then gave a booster dose of Pfizer, and it seemed that really boosted antibody levels. So I want to say that there are some entities that have looked into mixed dose, but we don't have any data on it yet.
Oh, okay.
So my understanding is at this point, even though there's little, studies and things like that, that at this point, any information that comes out is going to be a match dose for now.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
where this becomes a little tricky, though, is in recently there's been information showing that the Moderna vaccine seems to be holding up a little bit better against Delta than Pfizer and Johnson and Johnson. So, I want to be very clear that any information I share is going to be what is consistent with FDA and CDC recommendations.
Right.
At this point, Pfizer submitted for boosters for Pfizer recipients, and that if boosters are approved this week after the CDC meets on Wednesday and Thursday, then it will be Pfizer recipients first.
Okay.
Moderna submitted information for boosters for Moderna recipients, and Johnson & Johnson is doing the same.
Okay.
I don't expect that we'll see information on mixed dose series for some time, like it may be a few months potentially.
Okay. Now, how is it that the studies are being done on those who have been vaccinated? How do they know that their protection's waning? Do they give them antibody tests?
They're doing some antibody testing too, but like I said, they kind of have seemed to determine a level that seems to be protective, but everybody's bodies are different. So what protects you or I may not protect someone who has other health issues. The major ones for COVID, I think many of us know, but just to restate, are obesity, being overweight, diabetes, heart disease, those kind of things too. And so depending on what other conditions you may have, you may be at higher risk. And so there's no such thing as sort of a universal level, just like there's also no such thing as a universal risk for COVID. When we hear about this misinformation, people saying, oh, your risk of getting COVID is X percent and your risk of dying is Y percent. We really can't use that because not everyone's body is the same. And so people do have different risks. I do think at this time, we don't know for sure. They are doing antibody testing. They're also just they do some monitoring. They vaccinate you and then wait to see what happens to you over the course of the year, see if you get it, how do you do,
Yeah.
See if you get hospitalized. And so a lot of those are what we call longitudinal studies where they just watch people for a while and see how things go. And then they're trying to get that information together. I will say though that many of us, I think watching the CDC or the FDA meeting, on Friday, got the impression that they just weren't ready to have this discussion yet. Honestly, it was maybe a little earlier because a lot of the data, even the data that Pfizer was presenting to make their case for boosters, wasn't complete, which is why, the boosters weren't recommended for everybody. There's certainly some considerations that they just didn't have answers for at this time, and they're going to continue to get information too, or collect information too.
Well, it's probably not important to be in a rush. I mean, yes, everyone wants to be protected, but don't rush to get stuff out there just to get it out there. I mean, everybody, we're all in this in terms of a guinea pig together, right? And we're all being tested kind of in a way that everyone needs to understand. And how else are you going to get this information without looking at the studies in a long-term situation?
Right. And like I said, there were some great questions, that were asked. And as I was presenting to my medical center about, the possibility of boosters last week, I presented a point and a counterpoint. The point was Delta is still raging. It's calming down a little, thank goodness. But, it's still out there. People are still being, getting sick and being hospitalized. People are still dying. We are coming up on a truly horrific milestone, starting to approach 700,000 deaths from this pandemic in the United States. So there's still a lot to be concerned about. We look at the data in Israel showing more hospitalizations and breakthroughs in people who've been vaccinated. There's a lot of reasons to consider giving boosters, but the other question is do we know that it's safe to give boosters to everybody right now?
Right.
Maybe people, younger adults who are fully vaccinated may not be at the same risk of breakthrough infections, may not be at the same risk for hospitalizations. And there are some concerns, in particular, one that often comes up is the myocarditis or pericarditis, which is inflammation of the heart that can occur, particularly in young males who've been vaccinated. And so the question was, if we give them boosters, does that going to amplify their risk, or are they going to be okay? And we don't know. And so that is the reason the FDA said, we need more information. We're not going to recommend it for everyone at this time. Let's look at those who are at highest risk at this time. And so as we get more information in this week and in the coming weeks, we'll be able to hopefully give a little bit more guidance on what people should be doing.
Oh, well, that's good. I'm glad that you're on top of that. Now, just one last thing before we close out is the flu shot. I know that during the whole COVID, there really wasn't any discussion about influenza whatsoever. It was all COVID-19. So now, people are probably contracting the flu, and we're actually recognizing that it's the flu and not COVID. Because I think anytime you get anything, you're like, oh my God, do I have COVID? As opposed to
Right.
whether or not you have anything else. So, what would you recommend people do about the flu shot?
Absolutely want to recommend everyone get their flu shot. I got mine last week. I want you to know I put my money where my mouth is. Like I said before, I'm vaccinated against COVID as well, and looking forward to getting a booster, most likely since I'm a healthcare worker. But you absolutely should get your influenza vaccine. The biggest difference, I would say, between last year and this year is that we were still pretty much locked down for most of fall and winter. We still had our masking guidelines. People were still masking and adhering to those quite a bit more. Now we're much more open. People aren't necessarily masking to the same degree. Things are starting to open up again. More performances and everything else like that. As you go out more, your chances of being exposed do increase. And I want to be clear that masking does help protect against influenza, but washing your hands really, really does too, because influenza is something that actually will survive on surfaces that you touch. And so those are the things that are helpful. So in all cases, vaccination is most important. And then, social distancing when you can, masking, hand washing, these are things to best protect yourself with both of these viruses circulating. We are not seeing a lot of influenza in the community yet. In Southern California, it usually starts peaking around the holidays, around December, and then going until about March. And it normally is pretty unpleasant. And I agree. You can't tell when you get sick right now initially what you have, unless you lose your sense of smell or something like that. But there's also been data that showed recently that those who had been vaccinated against influenza also did better if they did get COVID. And we don't know if it's just some other protection that your immune system makes at those times. So we want to make sure that everyone is vaccinated against both viruses as we go into this rather uncertain winter that we're heading into.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Burnette, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate all the information.
Absolutely.
All right. And we'll be right back after this.